first time in a long time for our events. It's not raining outside and terrible, so it's great to have you all here on such a beautiful day as well. So, today we're going to be talking about ground perspectives on the war against the Islamic State, and we're going to really be having a conversation about the past, the present, and the future. Now more than ever, it's time to really put all the pieces together, because one of the challenges for looking at ground perspectives is the lag time between understanding what's happening on the ground and what's happening sort of in DC and how we're looking at and discussing the problems that are happening thousands of miles away. So as someone who studies online stuff, which is really the focus of my own research, I think this is so important and why I love having my colleagues to the left of me working on these issues, because it's a great opportunity to tether our understanding of these issues and whether our assertions are true. And then another layer of that is the online space, at least in my experience, is deeply interconnected to what's happening on the ground. One of the things we were discussing before the panel is just the role of coordinated media campaigns around battles, Mosul, for example, and the sustained effort by the Islamic State to control the narrative around that event. So today, although there are quite a few op-eds out there, and great work, saying that ISIS isn't gone, there's still a battle waging on. I think that one of the things that we really wanted to do is set up an event, and if we're talking about moving towards a time where we're lightening our footprint, especially in terms of Iraq and Syria, but also as we look at different events around the world, what does it mean in terms of making sure we still have those boots perspectives and making sure that we do have connectivity to what's happening on the ground? So moving forward today, we're going to talk a lot about what are the partnerships that still matter, who are we up against, and how can we define them even as they're changing body, and really what are we up against in terms of being able to define that and keep those issue areas really at top of mind as we move forward. So today we're joined by three superstars to my left. We have Dr. Craig Whiteside, and I'll give you their bios right before each of them speak. But Craig will talk about how the Islamic State leadership, or we'll talk about the role of Islamic State leadership and discuss the organization's use of intelligence and special operations. Then next, Brett Riker will discuss and share his perspectives on some of the more recent efforts in Iraq and Syria and highlight how measures shape dynamics on the ground. And lastly, Dr. Ingram, Harara J. Ingram specifically, will reflect on ground efforts to stop the resurgence of the Islamic State in the Philippines, particularly Mindanao. So, to get us started, I will hand it over to Craig. Craig is an associate professor at the Naval War College.
That's the Naval Postgraduate.
Or Naval Postgraduate. I really already messed it up already. Product placement. Sponsored. Just kidding. But he's a fellow at the Program on Extremism and ICCT in The Hague. And Craig's research focuses on the doctrinal influences of leadership in the Islamic State and its evolving strategies. He has a PhD in political science from Washington State University and is a former U.S. Army officer with combat experience. So,
Thank you, Audrey. This is my second panel with Audrey this week, so we'll do a role reversal up in Toronto, so I'm pretty excited for that. I'll be talking about what I call the universal insurgency period. And universal meaning that they're 100% insurgents as opposed to part state, and before they were part state and part insurgency. Now it's universal insurgency, and they've been in this phase before. I studied the origins of the Islamic State from October 2000. Is it on or not?
Oh, no.
I saw you making gestures. Sorry. Calm down a bit. So I studied their origins from when they declared the Islamic State in October of 2006. We knew them as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but they're properly described as the Islamic State of Iraq, at least that's what they call themselves. And I looked at their documents, internal documents, captured documents on the battlefield, and that's what I did my PhD dissertation on, was the Islamic State's political worldview. Right now they have no physical territory, as most of us understand. That's a very big problem for them for a variety of reasons. Audrey would say, certainly from a propaganda perspective, that's important. It's also important for the physical aspect. They're foreign fighters, both this time and in their previous apex, their previous cycle of success, 2006. They brought the foreign fighters in. When they lose territory, it is very difficult for them to integrate those folks into what the rest of the locals are doing, which is a more clandestine insurgency. So their transition to insurgency does not include foreign fighters. So this is a big problem for them, as you're seeing in Southeast Syria right now. So the question is, what will IS be successful again? There are people who are already making the leap, say that this is kind of they'll bounce, they'll make a quick bounce and a resurgence. So is that going to happen? That's the question. There are already people answering that question in the affirmative, and there are other people who are ready to dismiss the group as you know, a flash in the pan, a group that overreached and has kind of culminated at this point. Mark Twain said that history rhymes, or supposedly said that history rhymes. If you look deeper and try to find that, you won't actually find that he said that ever in any different place. The most accurate depiction I've seen is that he said that it's actually, history can be reconstructed, or the future, through broken fragments of the past. Broken meaning some of them are true in the future, they can be repeated, and most of them won't be. And so I think that's a way to look at this idea of the Islamic State's previous history, their success in bouncing back, as they did successfully return to prominence in 2014, as everyone knows. So we'll try to tease that out. The new insurgency looks a lot like the old insurgency, right? Same as the old insurgency, meaning before 2014. We've got parts of Syria, Iraq, Libya, Sinai, Afghanistan, Somalia, and the Philippines, all active insurgencies of varying degrees of prominence around the world. Those are active, but they're not controlling territory. They are made up of periodic guerrilla attacks and terror attacks, as you understand. In two places, West Africa and Yemen, they probably are controlling small amounts of territory. So you can see they do even have variation within their affiliates across the world. And that's really based off of a variety of factors. A lot of times environmental, their own internal structures of these affiliates, and the leadership. This is reflected in a concept, archipelago insurgency. McInlay lays out in 2011 that he talks about what really reflects the Islamic State today, which is a disparate, non-contiguous series of insurgencies that are loosely connected and sometimes even actively influenced and directed. So let's look at the strategy. What's the strategy of insurgency? Because we use the term and then we really think of it as this vague series of activities happening. What's the strategy? Is to husband the resources, human capital, protect leadership, build some momentum for the future, and that's largely dependent on their protagonists or their antagonists. The strategy is somewhat of a cumulative one, meaning it's somewhat like attrition, although not like attrition as we understand in the conventional sense. In the irregular sense, it's an idea of slowly whittling away your opponents so that they collapse. You see that in 2014 in Mosul. It's much more, not this coup de main, where they come into Mosul and the Iraqi army collapses and goes away. It's really, in my research and in my opinion, a long cumulative campaign of attrition-like assassinations, guerrilla attacks that are wearing down psychologically and physically their opponents. And if you look at the data, that's what it shows rather than a quick collapse. So the leadership is trying to inspire this campaign to continue, right? And they're making decisions for that. It's quite often referenced through the management of savagery, but I think the management of savagery even then is simplistic and it is kind of a basic doctrine of how to start these kind of insurgencies, but not necessarily how to maintain them over the long term, which takes a lot of logistical support, it takes a lot of financial support, it takes a lot of dedication to continue these guerrilla attacks that, although they're frustrating for the counterinsurgent, it's hard to measure how you're going to be successful doing them. It just seems like this endless insurgency. They have to motivate their fighters to do this, right? That's one of the things the leadership are trying to do. If you look back at the conditions in Iraq and in Syria that allow the Islamic State to rise to the fore in 2014, Certainly there's contentious politics that helps create an environment for them to create an alternative for the population to look at. But the U.S. was absent at the time. That's not, at least for now, it's not an actual environmental condition. The U.S., despite originally talking about withdrawing from one theater and might be asked to withdraw from the other theater or state, it looks like for now that the U.S. will be present, and that's something that's different now than was in the past. In 2011, we saw a concerted effort by the Islamic State to prepare for the departure of the United States, and then to take advantage of it almost immediately in 2012. 2012, when U.S. forces were not there, they're very successful in really stepping up the level of attacks, and we see a huge surge in the summer of 2012. The leadership now, just as then, is really looking to try to hold off internal divisions. That's something that Audrey's going to talk about in Toronto, but they have extremists within their own ranks. I know that's ironic to think of this group that we label as an extremist group to have their own extremists, but there's fairly good reporting and a lot of leaks from this schism within the Islamic State right now between Abu Bakr and some of the more mature leaders and the leaders that have been around for quite some time, and the extremists who want to be even more, I'd say, harder on folks who did not join their campaign, meaning Sunni Arabs, either in Syria and Iraq, who did not join them. So to date, Abu Bakr has been able to do that. He's been able to come out of hiding, which is where he is, and actually rearrange, let's say, the Shura Council in order to achieve a balance between the extremists and the moderates. As you will, that's a simplification, of course. Abu Omar in 2006-07, when the first emir of the Islamic State of Iraq, Abu Bakr's predecessor, faced the same kind of dilemmas to a much lesser degree. So you actually see more frustration and fragmentation now than you did before. So that's interesting to see if the leadership will be able to hold that together, and quite possibly could spiral out of control. But Abu Omar was successful, and I would argue, with not a lot of proof, but certainly I think some of this will come out in the future, is that Abu Omar Baghdadi in the 2008 to 2010 period was busy trying to consolidate Sunnis who were still against the government, but were waffling on whether to reconcile with the Iraqi government or not. And I think there was, particularly by 2010, a large swing back in the direction of continuing the fight. A large benefit that the Islamic State at the time had was political consistency of goals from understanding Clausewitz and this idea of having a consistent policy of regime change, i.e. the establishment of the caliphate in areas outside of the Iraqi government control, which is what they did. This policy goal has been consistent since Zarqawi in 2002-03. So that has made their life easier as opposed to their rivals who've had really changing goals, either to integrate with the Iraqi government, and then when that's a little bit frustrated, some of them are coming back. That's why the rivals of the Islamic State, which were successful in 2007 in defeating them the first time, and I do characterize them today as defeated in the sense that their political project is in shambles. They have no territory, which is really kind of the ethos of the group. And with that gone, they're defeated. Certainly that defeat is not permanent. That defeat, just like in 2007, is not determinative of the future. The last thing I'll talk about is my current research, which is special operations. That's certainly, from a Western perspective, is how we primarily, it's one of the primary tools that we use, both for counterterrorism, but also in a more a light version of counterinsurgency, whether it's advise and assist, or even direct action missions throughout Iraq and Syria, let's say, but also in Africa, and even in some cases in Asia. So we focus a lot on our use of them and not necessarily what is our adversary doing to develop this same kind of capability. Surprised to see it, to be honest. The study of this idea of insurgency is this continual death by 1,000 cuts, these small guerrilla actions and terrorist actions that are throughout the theater, sometimes focused in certain locations, but the overarching intent is to kind of collapse your opponent from within, as they describe it. That's how the Islamic State described it in 2009. But even then, that is not going to be enough to either motivate their folks to continue the fight. And so what they've actually experimented with is special operations. And it's very rare because if they develop a special operation capability, it will be targeted by us. It will be visible, a cohesive unit that has special training that is able to do high-level attacks. That's going to draw a lot of attention. And they're, again, as insurgents, that's something that they want to avoid. So they have a different way of doing special operations. But what it does for them is is to create very discrete operations. We've counted 3, possibly 4 in a period of over 10 years, right? And it's used to kind of move the needle. It's obviously used to have a strategic impact, but to kind of rise above, since their actions, unlike ours, don't have these huge strategic impacts like the capture of Mosul, right? The successful capture of Mosul and Raqqa and taking it away from the Islamic State. These are huge strategic events. They don't have that in a guerrilla insurgency. They just have maybe occasional terror attacks that get headlines, but then they disappear within a day or two. Special operations is their kind of asymmetric way of changing that dynamic. There's the one that attracted us the most was the 2012 Haditha raid, where they took about 100 insurgents. They trained them up. They disguised them as police officers. They took over the town of Haditha in Anbar province for a night, and then they executed several awakening members who were key in keeping Haditha linked to the Iraqi government. Once that tie is cut, their intent was to try to then be able to access Haditha better than they were able to before. I'm not sure that actually happened, but it was a very successful raid, and they were able to pull it off. They're usually dangerous, vulnerable, and difficult to pull off, and yet they were able to do this in 2012. They do another one in 2013. It's the Abu Ghraib prison breakout. It's a special operation because it's something that required specialized training, but it looked very, in other aspects, it looked very conventional. They used indirect fire to kind of hold units in place. They blocked all the roads to Abu Ghraib. They had an insider operation, free the prisoners who were also armed, and allowed them to protect themselves until they could get in. So intricately planned. Obviously, there's some kind of insider aspect to it, and it broke out 500 hardcore ISIS leaders from the previous iteration of the group that went on to leadership positions in the group as it rose in that next year to the caliphate. So these are 2 examples that we found of these special operations. And they're qualitatively different from your normal insurgency, guerrilla attacks, and terror attacks, right? This mix that they have, and all insurgency do. So to conclude, there's no end state. The Islamic State, I don't think, in their strategy, which differs from ours sometimes, and we have to have an end state, right? Is it, ISIS completely gone off the planet? These kind of unachievable end states that we wrestle with and try to use to guide our strategy. In my reading of their documents, their own strategic documents, they don't have that. They have a realistic expectation that designating end states is actually something that's almost impossible to do. Timelines. They don't have timelines in their strategic documents. They have just an understanding that they'll do it until it works. That this is a formula that's shown success in the past. If they replicate it, if the conditions are supportive of it, that they'll be able to, that it will work. And you see, let's say Mosul, the fall of Mosul, it's probably and just one of many operations that are going on in order to achieve, to move the football down the field, so to speak. And yet, when the Iraqi forces collapse, due to a very long psychological campaign as well as a violent campaign. I think they were averaging 10 attacks a month in, 10 attacks a day in Nineveh province in 2013, not 2014. 2013 is the last count that I have. Once that happens, then they exploit it. And I'm not sure that's necessarily planned, right? It's at that point, it's just exploiting success. So however they do that, that's their understanding of how they will eventually be successful if they choose to continue on with insurgency. I think it's fairly obvious that they've transitioned to insurgency and that transition started before the Battle of Mosul, as far as how they defended both Mosul and Raqqa, and then this final position. But that they've transitioned over a slow period of time, moving resources around, flattening their structure, flattening their hierarchy, and then pushing resources to different places, and that's allowed them to have a quicker bounce off the bottom than we saw in 2008. So with that, I'll shut up.
Thanks so much. So next we're going to move on to Brett Reichert. So Brett is an Army officer serving in a fellowship sponsored by the Joint Chiefs of Staff / the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He studied in the policy management program at the McCourt School of Public Policy in Georgetown. He's deployed to Afghanistan twice in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, and most recently he returned from Iraq in support of Operation Inherent Resolve.
Thank you. I owe you an obligatory disclaimer. The words and the discussions that we're going to have here today do not represent the Department of Defense, the Joint Staff, or the Army. They're mine and mine alone. With that said, let's jump in. The only reason that I'm able to sit here behind this table and speak with any sort of authority at all in this matter is the fact that I deployed to Iraq in Mosul as a primary advisor to Peshmerga originally, overseeing the government's $289 million budget in an attempt to buy, man, train, and equip the force to defeat ISIS in East Mosul. I then transitioned to advising the counterterrorism service in West Mosul, and that is their elite special operations force, the Iraqi elite special operations force. That was one of 3 predominant Iraqi security force formations that would fight and prosecute the Battle of West Mosul. So that's the perspective that I bring to this panel specifically, but of course serving on the Joint Staff and in the Pentagon now, I have the opportunity to see the same thing unfold at the strategic level, which is absolutely fascinating, to be in Mosul, seeing and feeling ISIS, killing ISIS on a daily basis, and then getting to see it from the DC perspective in terms of how are the decisions that we're making here in this city affecting the ground in Syria currently, and vice versa. How are the decisions in Syria and Iraq, and around the world for that matter, affecting the strategic policy making that needs to happen, and how those two things converge at a certain point, and sometimes how they don't converge, and that's a problem. So I'm happy to speak all of that, but first I want to give you a simplistic answer to what ISIS was, and I would argue 2014 to current. The universal insurgency that Craig just spoke about is certainly the earlier periods of ISIS, but in Iraq and Syria, when they claimed the caliphate, if they were anything, and this is an overly simplistic example, but if they were anything, ISIS is an army. The state is built to make war. God knows no boundaries, and they absolutely must, first and foremost, expand. And so when you see Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi expanding out of Syria and into Mosul in 2014 and declaring a caliphate in the Al-Nuri Mosque, what you see is an army on the march. Now they've used tactics over several years to break down the psyche of the populations that they're going to attack, but in an overly simplistic manner, if you can conceive of it or build a framework for what ISIS was in that period of time, simply an army. We know what to do with armies. We know how to garner their vulnerabilities, we know how to exploit those vulnerabilities and snap them in half. But it takes time to understand that. And it is a tit for tat. ISIS was able to very, very, very rapidly innovate. And so as we're prosecuting this battle in East Mosul, tactics are changing daily. And what we eventually see is an army, ISIS, that had 2 years to prepare one of the most complex defenses I've ever seen in both East and West Mosul, starting to use asymmetric advantages to their advantage. One of them being on 24 February, we see for the first time, arguably, the first time at the tactical level, ISIS employ up to 10 quadcopters, DJI drones you can buy them at Costco for a few $100s. Now, I use the term swarming loosely. It's not technically in machine learning the same way of swarming that we might conceive of, but in a very rudimentary form, swarming where you have 4 to 10 quadcopters, all with the same kind of geolocations that they're going to autonomously fly to, and then their controllers can take over and move as necessary. But what you see from the other side of that, so ISIS is employing these 10 drones overhead, same location, and oh, by the way, they've rigged underneath of them with grenades. And those grenades, though don't create a ton of casualties, create a psychological impression that's meaningful. And so on 24 February, we're only 6 days into the march on West Mosul, and all of a sudden we see, and we're feeling 10 quadcopters, flying separate sorties. And so what it feels like is you're being swarmed. And for the first time in my military career, it felt as though we didn't have air superiority. And so what you find is these mortars dropping in precise locations that are targeting our counterterrorism service command structures. They're dropping mortars on Humvees. Those are up-armored Humvees, but you see secondary explosions because we have ammunition and mortars in the back of those trucks starting to explode, and only a few people die. But what you see is a psyche change. The counterterrorism force, the most elite force in the Iraqi formation, is stopped dead in its tracks on 24 February, the initial march into West Mosul. And they turn to us and they say, Sadie, what can you do? Certainly, you're the best military in the world. You can do something to stop these drones. We have no answer. The answer is camouflage, start looking up, run away. There's very simple things that we just cannot do. Yes, we do have an F-35. Yes, you've heard about that program. Very expensive. Not going to do anything for the DJI drone. So we find ourselves in this weird asymmetric fight where it's both conventional in nature, where we're seeing an army fight an army. And for that matter, when I say army, I want to be very clear. It's not our army. I'm there advising, assisting, accompanying, but it's very much the Iraqi forces. And in Syria, it's the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, that are doing the fighting. And Arar and I had a conversation a few weeks ago, and in which he asked that I would come here on this panel today and kind of give you the ground perspective of what that means. What does advise and assist and accompany mean? It gets ambiguous, and especially when we start smoking cigars and blowing all the smoke over maps and talking big thoughts, we sometimes forget that there are people who have to execute said policy and execute said operations. And what does that look like? So the advise and assist is very much, I would give you the advice is, say, which is term for sir, right? Sir, here's what we believe ISIS is doing in Mosul. This is the red pen. I'm going to draw out for you exactly how I see ISIS fighting in their centralized format. Here's how they're going to use that asymmetric advantage of the counter-UAS, or the UAS. Here's how they're going to use large suicide VBIDs. Here's how they're going to meticulously resource mortar positions and fire them in a manner that's centralized and meaningful in order to have a certain effect on you. And so we draw out the battlefield for them. That's the advice. Simple as that. And then we advise them, here's how you could potentially counter that. Simple. Advise. Assist. In the most simple format, because I think of things very simplistically, is we kill ISIS in front of them, unequivocally. Kill as many ISIS in front of our partners as we possibly can. And that's using our own networks, that's using our own formations, that's using our own weapon systems. How do we seek out and destroy as many of the enemy as we possibly can before our partner force has to continue on with the ground force maneuver? And then the accompanying piece is you gotta be with them. You have to be with them. Because there are days that are hard. We're not the ones doing the bleeding. They are. SDF are dying by the hundreds in a day. Certainly the CTS would see casualty after casualty after casualty. And you can only take so much of that before you're just frankly sick of it. And so the accompanying piece, and we assume, and I say we, the pejorative we, but the United States of America and its military, your military, is taking a little bit of additional risk in the accompanying approach to this strategy. But the accompanying approach is absolutely necessary because I have to be next to them, and I have to hold them on the shoulder and say, the bomber's inbound. I'm moving people. Move here. Move 1 block west. We're coming in hot. Just give it time. Stay in the battle. Keep the pressure on. ISIS is going to use every opportunity it has to refit if you stop now. Break ground, and they're going to see it in the propaganda campaign. It's going to be in a media campaign associated with it. You're going to look stupid. We've got to continue the fight. And so as an advise, assist, accompany sort of formation, what we're doing is we're attempting to get them in the right place at the right time to prosecute their ground combat. We're bringing the enabling packages, that's airstrikes. And oh, by the way, and I'd be happy to discuss them with the students, with the UAS, we eventually did come up with a solution, a commercial off-the-shelf solution. One of the number one, outside of international airports, one of the number one places that you would find a counter UAS system is stadiums. The NFL, for example. There's no reason why you should have a 4K drone flying around an NFL game. You would lose all your money. So what we do is we take one of those systems, buy it, it's a little expensive, but we buy it and we strap it to the back of the truck. And then we drive it into West Mosul the next morning. And I kid you not, in less than 26 hours, we're able to put in the electromagnetic spectrum a counter UAS system in a fighter-based sort of format where we're able to break the GPS link, the control link, and or the video link. And what you're able to do is once that quadcopter drops, I'm able to recover it in a short span. And there's a digital footprint inside of there that tells me every single time you've launched it, where you launched it from, the time you launched it from, and now I'm in your CP, now I'm in your command post. Because you can imagine, ISIS isn't overly complex, so the person who's controlling the fight, the person who's telling that particular suicide bomber to drive his car into a formation, the guy who's saying launch 50 mortar rounds, is also the same guy who's watching the video feed on his little DJI drone. So if I can get inside your command post and kill you, now I'm starting to fracture your network. And that's, you have to be inside the network. You have to be inside the ISIS framework in order to understand how it operates at the tactical and operational level. So that's what I bring to the panel. I'm happy to discuss any of those things in more detail. And then I do think that there's a little bit of a perspective, and I'll let Gerardo speak, but there's a little bit of perspective in terms of how we speak about the future. Because as you know, Saturday, the SDF announced territorial defeat of ISIS. We subsequently announced that in the Pentagon, and certainly at Operation Inherent Resolve. So we are at an inflection point. We and ISIS. Where are they going? What are they going to turn into? What is it that they do now? And how are we going to respond to it? Markedly different, qualitatively different than what I just described to you. And oh, by the way, we have to be absolutely certain about the sort of resourcing that we're giving to this fight in our strategy. Do we continue to prosecute ISIS worldwide? Absolutely. But at what cost? And are we able to still modernize a force that is capable of competing with China and Russia, say, in the next 10, 20, 30 years? And so those are the decisions that we're grappling with at the policy and at the strategic level. Is ISIS certainly still exists. We're certainly committed to defeating them worldwide, but we can't do that in a vacuum. We have to have hard conversations. And those conversations have to include potential other adversaries or competitors now that we're in this era of great power competition. So with that, I'll move on.
Awesome. My adrenaline is pumping. Rarely happens in a panel. Okay, so after that great presentation, we're going to move on to Gerardo. Gerardo is a senior research fellow at GW, GW's program on extremism, among many other topics. His research focuses on the role of propaganda in charismatic leadership and the evolution of and appeal of violent non-state political movements. Gerardo works really heavily with primary sources, but also a lot in the field. He currently runs several in-country applied research projects in regions focused on enhancing civil society and countering violent extremism capabilities. So, over to you.
Well, yeah, thank you. I guess what I want to do is kind of go further into the grassroots, and I suppose give some perspectives on how civilian populations have experienced this ISIS phenomenon. After all, it's the civilian populations that end up becoming the recruits for ISIS in its various kind of areas, but they're also essential, obviously, for the counter-ISIS effort. That winning the support of the population and in doing so, hopefully, taking away that pool of recruits and protection and intelligence for ISIS. I'm also going to move outside of Syria and Iraq and go into the Philippines. Since I left government national security roles in 2014, I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East and South Asia, and in the last 18 months, particularly in Southeast Asia and in Mindanao. So from late 2017, I've traveled to Mindanao every 6 to 8 weeks or so, running capacity building projects, mostly in Zamboanga, if you can imagine the kind of like Mindanao is like a horseshoe. On the western side, you have the Zamboanga Peninsula that leads down to the Sulu Archipelago. So looking in Zamboanga, in the Iligan Marawi area, which is kind of the top of that horseshoe, and then down in the kind of Cotabato through the Maguindanao kind of region, which essentially constitutes the three areas where ISIS influence has perhaps been the strongest. And I think that what's interesting about the example of Mindanao is that it offers us an opportunity to, I guess, contrast between the kind of analysis and perception that we have of the threat from thousands of kilometers away, from what is going on through what's being projected through social media, and just contrasting it with local perspectives, the grassroots, local kind of community perspectives. There's a tendency to look at what happened in Mindanao, specifically the Marawi siege, and kind of see it as this ISIS phenomenon kind of spreading kind of transnationally. The perspective from locals was very, very different. Their view of the Marawi siege was that it was an almost entirely local phenomenon. That these were young men, that they were breakaways from established kind of organisations who were trying to demonstrate, particularly the MILF leadership, but also more broadly to the population itself, that there was another way, in a crucial moment in the peace process, that there was another way to engage in insurgency warfare, that there was a different way to fight. And the Marawi siege, in a sense, gave them an opportunity to show that you can take your insurgency out of the jungles and into the urban centres, that you can drag your conventional forces into the kind of horrible kind of knife fight that Brett was describing here. That these aging leaders within the MILF, who would then go on to become the leaders of the Bank Somali Transition Authority, that these were out of touch with the harsh realities of life for the population in Mindanao, that they just didn't quite get it, and that ultimately that there was a dignity to struggle. Those of you who've spent any time in Mindanao will know, engaging with local pop, there's a great pride in being revolutionaries. You know, there's a great pride in that rebellious kind of streak. And so there were these really powerful cultural and historical levers that this group was attempting, not necessarily uniquely attempting to manipulate, but nevertheless were attempting to use, that we can continue this fight. There is a dignity in war, and there is a great shame in kowtowing to Manila. That there's in giving up not just decades but centuries of struggle. And this was the way that the Marawi siege, that the so-called Maute Hapalon group has been consistently described over 18 months of being in this region, talking to locals. That these were young men trying to prove a point to essentially the local status quo. The recruitment levers as well were highly localised. There's a tendency from DC, from London, from Sydney to kind of look and say, yes, this caliphate idea was such a powerful force for these local people, for the people of Mindanao, who supported the group. Consistently, that was not what was being described to me. These were the recruits into the Maute Hapalon group were largely from isolated, impoverished villages in the kind of jungle areas. You know, that for months and months, years essentially, this recruitment process had been going on, carrying bags full of pesos and going into these villages. And when I say a village, you might be thinking of these sprawling kind of huts and this kind of thing. No, not necessarily. These are very small collections of going in and handing over money and saying, we'd like to take your son. Some of the recruitment strategies that were described to me were, hey, why don't you come along with me? We'll take you to the camp. Obviously, this is pre-Marawi siege. We'll take you to the camp and you can see what it's like. Come and see what it's like, brother. Come and see what it's like to live with us and experience training. Experience what it's like getting regularly fed, having something to do with your life. Very, very pragmatic kind of factors. Essentially, you could call kind of these rational choice type levers. Cost and benefit. Well, you're kind of living the cost. Here are some of the benefits of coming with us. There are also very, very strong familial and ethno-tribal factors at play here, which this group sought to play upon. That recruitment occurred through family lines. I mean, literally sat in the car with locals, very upset on the phone, talking to sisters and cousins who were in the group, and trying to get them and trying to get them out. And the kind of arguments that they described having with this person. Oh, we should have known. We should have known that they were thinking about doing this, because they kept pushing back. They kept arguing with us on about whether it was theological issues, jurisprudential issues, or broader political issues. That there were these signs that they felt that they missed. But again, it wasn't just that those individuals left the family. They took family members with them, younger brothers and sisters. You saw the way that family and ethno-tribal kind of tensions, that the fault lines of those tensions then end up being expressed in their political allegiances. That sometimes families would divide to supporting one group over the other, largely because they hated the other side. And so, again, very highly localized, nuanced factors were what were kind of driving people towards or away from this so-called Maute. There's also a sectarian pall that gets hung over so much of the problems of violent extremism through Mindanao. It's Muslim-Christian tensions. You saw in the aftermath of the holo bombings a mosque in Zamboanga. There was a grenade attack there. There is this consistent Muslim kind of Christian divide, which violent extremists have historically tried to use as a lever, and certainly in the case of the Marawi-Sis, that was the situation as well. One of the first acts by the Maute Hapalon was to execute Christians. So I think that perhaps that this kind of perspective is that this perspective from locals is quite different to the view that comes, I guess, from a distance. You know, this top-down perspective of ISIS reaching out into these different regions of the world. There's a very important bottom-up dynamic. There's a very important local dynamic, which is just as important, and when you're in these countries, perhaps more important than those larger transnational dynamics. Something that was interesting, however, was the way that the Maute Hapalon, but particularly the way the Marawi-Sis itself perplexed, surprised locals. That, you know, it's a line that unfortunately we've heard from our own kind of strategists and politicians at times, that we've never seen anything like this before. It was this idea that, and the big shock for them was that the black shirts, that the black shirts came into Marawi, and locals said, oh, we didn't make too much of a big deal about it, you know, we just went on and kept shopping at the market and kept doing what we're doing, because we just assumed that they would go away. That's the way that insurgency works in this area. You go in, you give your so-called bloody nose, and you get out. Because you don't want to make life too hard for the local people. So the expectation was, after a few days, these black shirts would leave. When they didn't leave, there was this shock. And you see these exodus of people trying to get out. So much of that delay was an expectation that, well, this is the way that insurgency has always worked here. But those black shirts were trying to prove a larger point about how insurgency could be fought differently. That in fact you can hold urban areas. That in fact there is an advantage to dragging conventional forces into an urban area. And I think that perhaps more so with hindsight, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, that there was a bit of a focused idea here that there was this small vanguard, this small elite that would spark something much larger, that the conditions in Mindanao were so appalling for the average person, that the politics at the time, the uncertainty around the peace process was such that if this Maute Hapalon could spark enough that they could drag the population into supporting them. And certainly in the first couple of months, they must have taken some confidence in the surge of locals who would stream over Lake Lanao and fight with them. Now, a lot of times that was driven by wanting to get loot and wanting to get arms. Remember, of course, that the capture of Marawi started several days before Ramadan. Marawi city was packed with food, money. Several locals have described Marawi to me as an armory, just because of the culture of having a gun and the honour of being armed and this type of thing. And so, from the very beginning, looting of arms by locals, people coming in, taking what they want, and heading back out. The way that the battle itself was fought demonstrated that there was very little concern from the Maote themselves that they would run out of supplies. Although in the last weeks that obviously became a problem for them. So the strategy itself of capturing Marawi did surprise the locals. The fact that the Maote and Hapalon broke promises, didn't show respect to elders, was also seen as quite a shameful thing. And not just around the Marawi siege, but even leading up to the Marawi siege, locals kind of said, oh, it was very shameful that they did this. It was more shameful that they broke promises than that they actually, those early skirmishes, that they'd broken promises to elders, that they hadn't, that they'd broken away, and the conditions in which they'd broken away were not satisfactory in the minds of many there. And finally, the conduct during the siege itself, from the perspective of many locals, was appalling. The sexual abuse of women and of children. Not a lot of this has been released to the public because it is seen as a source of shame, I suppose. But there was appalling behaviour, particularly by foreign fighters. Perhaps we can talk later about how the complexities with trying to leverage these to demonstrate how the bad behaviour of these groups and to kind of highlight that say-do gap. But there are great sensitivities about that behaviour. Before I described locals from around the area coming to Marawi to fight and to take loot. What David Kilkenny would call kind of accidental guerrillas, coming in for very circumstantial reasons and then leaving. Well, that has created tensions, obviously, has created a lot of tensions, where the locals themselves were very, very conscious of the fact that others had come in and taken advantage of the horrible situation that they were in. And so I'll wrap up by just highlighting, I guess, some of the perspectives from locals as they've kind of looked back at the Marawi siege and I guess their interpretations of it. There was a real sense that this was an operation conducted with a strategic intent, that by going into Marawi at that point in time, that it was an effort to prepare for the much longer fight, to take arms, to take money, to take food, and ship it back over Lake Lanao into the thick mountainous jungle areas, and to settle in for a much longer fight, particularly through the peace process. Beyond that very practical sense, it was also a demonstration of what a different approach to operations and strategy could do. It set up an example to other groups in the area, to other groups who may be dissatisfied with the peace process as it plays out over the next year and a bit, that there are other options, that there are other groups operating in these areas, and there are different approaches to revolution that you can adopt. I don't think that we should downplay that powerful symbolism. Within months of mission accomplished, our networks were receiving reports that there were sermons presenting the case for why the Maote were martyrs within months, 3 months of siege ended. Little kids, again, regularly hearing reports, little kids say, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Maote. Why? We want to fight the tank and plane drivers we're going to fight like men. We want to be Maute. And so I'll just conclude by saying that the trauma that you witness in Marawi and in the surrounding areas in the IDP camps is immense. And we must be very, very careful, particularly when we look at this from a distance, not to downplay that very personal trauma, these deep psychosocial factors, and to assume that because of this ISIS being responsible for so much of that trauma, that the population will naturally turn against them. I think that, unfortunately, trauma represents an opportunity, and as time extends, it's an opportunity that can be used and manipulated by many different sides, and it's something we have to be very, very concerned about.
Thank you. So I'm going to run through 3 quick questions in sort of the reverse and get some answers and then open up for the audience. So starting with Hararo, I think one of the things that we've emphasized in this discussion, and I guess all of you, but Craig especially, is the sort of sociocultural, ethno-tribal ground perspectives and how they can be either a strength or a major weakness in policy planning. But ultimately, even though local nuances matter a lot, policy planning usually fails to sort of add in and bake in that flexibility to sort of factor in those decisions or work with it in real time. So moving forward, how do you think we can better prepare to have local perspectives inform our counterterrorism approaches? And what can we do better to work with local networks, especially?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one fundamental way to do it, and that's got to get onto the ground. It's we have to take. We have to be. I think universities have to be far more willing. I think governments have to be far more willing to send people into these communities and to spend time in these communities, engaging with these populations where they live. I talk a lot to NGOs and who are doing capacity building work whether it's in Mindanao or when I was working with this kind of Syria and things like this in Bangladesh, and often that they will ask about local contacts. Oh, can you connect us to some local networks in those kind of areas? And I'm reluctant and very rarely, in fact, I don't do it. But the point is that when I ask them, oh, well, what contacts have you made? Oh, well, we met with a very interesting NGO in Manila and a civil society group in Manila. And it's always this capital kind of, in the capital cities, far away from the actual communities themselves. And just because they come from that country doesn't mean that they have any deep insights into that local population in any way whatsoever. There are risks associated with this kind of work, but those risks are absolutely manageable. And if we're going to take policy and strategy development seriously, we have to encourage a culture of sending people into these places to learn. The kind of wine sipping, 5-star dinners, CSO contacts, it's just not going to cut it. It hasn't cut it up to this point in time. The CV industry has benefited from this kind of culture, and we've just got to break that down.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So moving on to Rhett, I'm going to give you a big question.
Big question.
Yeah. So on one hand, I know that you can speak to the regional and strategic implications that are really vital to understanding the problem set, but also your on-the-ground experience can give you sort of that local level partnership angle and sort of understanding the importance of what we were discussing sort of earlier is like the fog of war and even confidence of the people who are on the ground fighting. And so as we look at U.S. foreign policy and foreign policy around the world, sort of what are the implications at both levels? So what does it mean for our partners in terms of sort of big picture strategic implications and regional dynamics, as well as sort of more local level, community level, or even looking at a unit, a combat unit?
That is a big question.
Yeah. Have fun with that.
Thanks. I think you could, fundamentally, you can break it down 2 different ways. Really, I think honestly, in a human being on human being sort of relationship level, so that's me, locals, or whatever apparatus of our U.S. government with a local population, Certainly an announcement like one that we've made recently about a withdrawal from Syria. Let's just talk about that elephant in the room. Certainly there's implications at echelon. That sort of regional or localized view of, say, what the Syrian Democratic Forces are feeling right now and saying, I thought you guys were going to be here for a lot longer. I thought you were going to see this through to phase 5. We're going to work into stability operations. We were planning on standing up these local security forces to ensure that local populations don't fall back in the same sort of resurgent tactics that this universal insurgency is going to inevitably present. And so in some aspects, you could say that our local partners almost feel left behind. That's fair. And I do think that in some instances could be the case. Certainly, rightfully from their perspective, that is the case. From our perspective, though, I think, like I said earlier, is we have to be very pragmatic about the way in which we look at the decisions we're making. Spending money, spending time, whether it be deployed lives in the form of the State Department or the military or whatever national instrument you choose, it comes at a cost, and that opportunity cost is meaningful. And so from our more strategic perspective, it's what are we willing and what are we unwilling to do? And so to say, hey, we need to right size, we need to optimize our joint force in a way that makes sense for the next 10 years, that might mean that we don't have as many people in Syria, in Iraq, or where have you. Because we're trying to optimize in ways that perhaps the Philippines is the next place we need to go. Or there's nowhere that we need to go and we need to modernize the force and we need to build a ready force. Or perhaps there's another national instrument of power that we can use. And I know all too often we use the military instrument of power, but in everything that Gerard just explained, I am the last thing you want to use. The absolute last thing that's going to have a meaningful impact other than just escalating this thing into a full-blown conflict. So wrestling with those relationships is difficult. Now, I will say that there are operational things. So I said at echelon, there are things that we are talking about with, say, the Iraqi forces, for example. How do you reconstitute a force like the counterterrorism service or the Iraqi army or the federal police that have the ability to continue to prosecute potential resurgence ISIS, be it in Syria or Iraq? Well, those are things that we're willing to spend time and money on. Those are things that don't cost as much in terms of man hours, be it at the localized level. But the battle for Mosul that I described was a bloody one. Thousands and thousands and thousands of very, very capable elite service members in the Iraqi security forces are no longer with us. And so to reconstitute that sort of thing is, to a lot of people, inconceivable, where it takes years and years and years. We've had 15 years to build the CTS to the capacity that they were, and to throw them at a problem set like Mosul and ISIS and gain that territory back is immensely costly to their government. So the sort of strategic or operational, if you will, advising that's happening now is, how do we retrain these forces? How do we recruit the right Iraqis? How do we recruit the right local Syrians to take this problem set on? But then how do we, as a government, invest in the right ways that are going to be meaningful? I'll give one odd example. When I was advising the Peshmerga, so the Kurdistan regional government, and this was a conversation I had with a State Department colleague, is how we're investing money to defeat ISIS is very short term. I need to buy ammunition, I need to buy a new bulldozer, I need to buy tank rounds. Check. That's the easy stuff. But how do we build a system of the Peshmerga, or the Iraqi security forces, that's going to be lasting? And so we had to start talking about a retirement system. How do we get the old generals out, and so that we can create a system that's not an up or out sort of system, but how do we get a new generation of fighters built? How do we train, retain that force in a meaningful way? And that's an intellectual sort of conversation that you have to have, that's still very much advising. It's still very much in the military and diplomatic side of our national instruments of power, but it's one that's looking out at 25 years instead of the next 2 years or the next 3 years. And so those are the conversations that I think we need to take from a policy and strategy sort of perspective and say, there are things that we're willing to spend money and time on, and there are things that are not. Perhaps, and this is just perhaps, it's not as meaningful for me to send the military forces in to the Philippines to have some sort of short-term solution set. But it might be that I'm looking 20 years out at building a legitimate retirement system and building hospitals that can reconstitute a force in the eventuality that ISIS comes back and resurges. So those are sort of the high-level topics. Very, very different. Very different from talking to a machine gunner in the counterterrorism service. that feels left behind because his counterparts are leaving. But those are the sorts of things that we're dealing with, and I think as long as you're transparent, as long as we can communicate that sort of rhetoric and that narrative, as long as it's actually a decision, a policy decision that's made, that can be communicated at echelon, it makes things a lot easier. So when we're in the ambiguous environment, where we're not sure what each other is doing, that these sorts of relationships fall apart. And when they fall apart, they take decades to rebuild.
Great. Okay, so Greg, moving on to you. So part of what you've really brought to the table today is just how conditional and volatile these on-the-ground partnerships and relationships can be, and really all of you spoke to this today. But as you sort of highlighted in your piece, we tend to sort of look for the same like flags and sort of say, well, this has happened in the past and thus this is going to happen in the future. So can you help us parse out really what does that look like for now, and what are the elements we need to be paying attention to, and what are the ones that we can sort of say, especially, you know, learning from the 2009, 2010 period in Iraq and looking at where we are now?
So that's a huge question. I'm only going to answer parts of it because I think the Q&A would be really interesting for everybody. The political conditions haven't changed really dramatically from the 2009 perspective. In some cases, they've actually gotten worse. There's some additional stability in both places, but the governance has the type of, is producing the type of grievances that Herrero talked about. Long-lasting grievances, but they can be highlighted by political entrepreneurs. So, one question I'd look at seriously is how are Sunni areas of Iraq and Syria governed and managed? And how do centralized governments or powers, what is their vision and understanding of that? If you look at Sunni areas today, they're not being governed like they were in 2009-10. When at that period, it was largely outsourced from a security perspective to about 100,000 awakenings, which there were really 100,000 of them, but a large number of Sunni auxiliaries who were in support of the government. Today, that number is 7,000. Right? So there's a change in the calculus of the government on who they're going to outsource this to. They're outsourcing it to others, and those might not actually be. The awakening wasn't spectacularly efficient in fending off ISIS. As a matter of fact, it's largely co-opted by them. But what I'm afraid that the local government learned was that was soft coin. So what we really need is harder coin. Right, much more hardcore. You'll see that in detention facilities. You'll see that in policies, extrajudicial killings, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of that are happening under the radar, and then feed into the dynamics that both my colleagues here are talking about. And then the Syrians, what happens now that we've reached this milestone event of the Islamic State's reduced caliphate and the caliphate no more. What is the reaction to the who's going to control this Syrian, or at least the Syrian, the Sunni Arab areas of Syria post ISIS, and that's evolved over time. I know our forces have said that the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are the best partner force that they have worked with in their careers. So going back into the early 1990s in some cases. It's quite a high compliment. The question is politically, are they a viable option for the future? What is their political stability? And it's hard to see from a political science perspective that actually working. Kurdish Marxist influence with Sunni Arabs who are kind of the foot soldiers. So we'll see. But that's one large question I would ask is how do you plan on controlling territory that you've had trouble administering? So that's the first one. Again, I don't think it's determinative that ISIS is going to come back. Be careful to say a lot of people think that what happened in 2014 was a fluke. You mentioned that they were an army, that they did have an army by 2014 plus. Well, it takes a long time to build an army. You said, how long does it take to build a CTA? So how long did they have to build that? So it's not a fluke, but it also doesn't influence necessarily how determinative it's going to be that they're coming back. We have a better, sober, more realistic appraisal of ISIS capabilities, their innovations, as you mentioned, and so hopefully that sober appreciation will last. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so we're going to open it up to the audience. I know we're running tight on time, so let's get 3 questions maybe all at once, and then we'll have our panelists. Okay, right front.
Hi, Raphael Gregorian from the State Department. Thank you, really very, very interesting and timely. Thanks for putting it together. 2 questions. One is, you say we reached an inflection point. I think you're right on that, but there's another big elephant in the room, and that's Idlib province. There's thousands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS packed in there, including a lot of people who are likely to become external plotters and be exported from the region and cause threats out in the future. Second thing is I was really struck by the totality of the presentation and your mention of John McKinley's book on Insurgent Archipelago. There seems to be a theme here which sounds to an old Cold War era person like myself, and it's like Maoist insurgency, right? Building up guerrilla attacks from a rural base until you develop a main force that can move into urban areas. And stripping out the Islamist extremist vision here of ISIS, I mean, how much do you see of that kind of insurgent or Maoist type insurgent doctrine being something similar to ISIS, or is that just a superficial comparison? Thanks.
And then I think the other question back here.
Hi, my name's Justin Powerful, who's out in Hamilton. First, let me thank GW for putting on this program and thank all the panels for taking the time out here. It's very informative. I'm wondering if, it's a question for all the panel, if anybody's able to kind of offer any insights and local on-the-ground perspectives on how ISIS uses the cyber domain. Thinking that this particularly could be important as everyone here highlighted, ISIS is moving towards insurgency type operations, asymmetrical type operations, and what can the U.S. do in operating opportunities and challenges for the U.S. there? Thank you.
Okay, and then Jeff, question?
Yeah, thank you very much for doing this. You mentioned the foreign fighters a couple of times. What do you see happening now to the foreign fighters who are still in Iraq and Syria, who haven't been captured, and how many of them perhaps got out before the end, since perhaps they foresaw how difficult it would be to blend them in? And then the other question I have is, it seems like there are a lot of similarities between how ISIS has been able to operate in Iraq and Syria and build itself up, and what it's been able to do in the Philippines and some other areas in terms of building on, getting to know those local communities and building on those grievances. Is part of the difficulty or the challenge with fighting ISIS worldwide the fact that it's created or stumbled upon a model that is very easy to replicate and goes far beyond the idea of just simply having a caliphate?
I know, but I was hoping you would take the cyber question.
Yeah.
I know you do.
Yeah,
That's really
I can wrap up with that one and
Okay,
sort of
so
speak to
we'll
that.
outsource that.
Yeah,
Who's moved back down?
yeah,
Okay.
let's do that.
You tackle the Maoist question.
I will tell you. They are influenced by, if you looking at, and I'm not the only person to say this. Michael Ryan wrote a great book, Decoding Al Qaeda. It's applied to Al Qaeda, but it's certainly they're running in the same stream. And the idea of the Maoist insurgency, they largely do not directly attribute it to Mao. That would be difficult for Islamists to talk about an atheist in a positive manner. But they certainly have plagiarized to no small degree all of the documents that they have. You can find phrases, whether they translate well from Arabic into, back into English from Chinese or whatever, but certainly the ideas are there. They're modified, but like the Marxist, different, not necessarily Marxist, let's say different applications of Maoist doctrine, let's say in China by Mao versus the Vietnamese were different. And so I think they have, and kind of to answer Jeff's question at the same time, that they do seem to have a model. It does, I think, play out in the Philippines. Aurora was giving you this bottom-up view of what locals say, but honestly, I heard the same thing in Iraq in 2007 about how terrible Al-Qaeda was and why were they so dumb and yet Al-Qaeda in Iraq / Islamic State of Iraq makes that bounce off because of structure, because of ideas and doctrine, because of a model that they see as being successful. From the Philippines, from the top-down perspective, add to what Aurora is, and he and I talk about this all the time, we're writing partners frequently. There's some evidence that the Islamic State directed Marawi. I have not seen strong corroboration of that, but there's at least, I've seen two sources, both in government and outside of government, saying that it was directed, and it was actually an idea of distracting from the problems of the core, because the core is going down. How do you maintain morale? Well, you have something morality, but it's quite possible they sacrificed that affiliate, both its opportunities and its leadership, which has been decimated. And one thing the Islamic State has done a great job of doing from Zarqawi on, they're dead, but in over a decade they've had 3, possibly 4 leaderships. That's fairly stable. We've probably had more, right? So they protect leaders, and they weren't able to in the Marawi case. So that's interesting. But I think, you know, to wrap up and to return to your question, they've created their own doctrine. It has distanced itself from management of savagery to some degree. They've created their own ideas, like I alluded to in insurgency, how to fight these terror insurgent activity, how to integrate these terror insurgent activities towards the achievement of a political goal, however far out, and then integrating innovations in. The quadcopter is a good example of that, surprising the enemy as they approach Mosul, but also the introduction of special operations, which you won't see when the U.S. has sufficient capabilities in place to identify and crush those. And so no one's going to waste a lot of time creating that capability. As I said, they create this capability on a needs base, and then they disappear it, which is it's an innovation of itself. We have long-standing special operations. But if you see the U.S. continue to retrograde out, as you were pointing out, if that's a possibility, that's the opportunity they'll look for. And so they are opportunistic in that aspect, which I think is a way to describe that Maoist doctrine of, you know, retreat. But, you know, when the enemy's strong, you retreat. So
I'll take part of the foreign fighter question. So you asked specifically about the foreign fighters who haven't been captured, which is an interesting approach. As the SDF kind of approached on their axis of advance, there's very, very limited opportunity for opportunistic actors to move back into the local populations. In that sense, it was very much, and it still is very much, a conventional sort of military operation where you have a frontline trace, and as population flow through that porous frontline trace, they're systematically being screened, essentially, which is why you see in the Middle Euphrates River Valley most recently, the operation takes such a slow pace. There are unforeseen amounts, tens of thousands of folks that are moving out through, and so the SDF had to take a very deliberate approach, which is why we've been almost haphazard in announcing this territorial defeat of ISIS, because every day it's like, not quite yet, because we still have the size of Fredericksburg, Maryland, in my last week's account of IDPs flowing out of the Middle Euphrates River Valley. So that said, certainly there are aspects of that population that are ISIS affiliated, ISIS fighters, potentially foreign fighters, but I think those are minimal. I think the larger question about foreign terrorist fighters is what we do with all of them that have been captured. There are thousands of people, both fighters and their families, and I think this is the difficult part to deal with, is what do you do with the women and children associated with the ISIS fighters that are in the IDP camps? And they belong to dozens of nations worldwide. And so what you see currently with regard to the foreign terrorist fighter situation is you've got an SDF who's a U.S. partnered, U.S.-backed partnered force, but they're not a sovereign government. And so by all measures, they can't necessarily hold these people in perpetuity. So what do we do with foreign terrorist fighters? Thousands of them that have been captured by our U.S.-backed partner force, along with the other 78 coalition members, I will add. What do we do with them? And you have to reach out to their governments, and with a packet of intelligence or evidence that would allow them to be prosecuted in their local governments, if that country will have them. And that's the position we find ourselves in. So we have to continue to back these forces. We have to continue to ensure that they're being treated, the detainees are being treated appropriately. But at the same part, it's a large lift on the Department of State to work out these sort of relationships and then have the execution of it be in a military aspect. in terms of how do we repatriate some of these foreign terrorist fighters. The big question with foreign terrorist fighters are for the nations that aren't willing to accept their so believed citizens back in. If they're not willing to repatriate, the question is what do we do? That's a policy question that's in the future, certainly not one that I'm able to speak to. But that is the larger question, I think, with regard to foreign terrorist fighters. The second part is, you mentioned the franchising. That's how I am putting words into your mouth. But franchising of ISIS, and I want to be careful. It's an existential threat to a certain degree. But I want to be very careful that we don't misinterpret or mischaracterize a global, trans-regional threat that ISIS may be. In a lot of ways, I think that's a vulnerability. In that, globally, they can talk to one another. But realistically, it's a very disparate organization. It's not like a centrally run franchise that you would see, again, a simplistic example, McDonald's, right? ISIS core cannot control what's happening in the Philippines. And even if they tried, that's a very easy link, a neural link that we can, in the military dimension or many other national instruments of power, break that link and fix, isolate, and then subsequently do whatever we need to do with it. So it's easy for us to say, ISIS core can't talk to the Philippines, now let's take care of the localized problem that we're already described. And so in a lot of ways, I think that we may mischaracterize, and this is part of their narrative, is to characterize this global enemy, this existential threat that's everywhere. It's in your cities, it's on your bus, it's in the metro on the way to work, and that's just not necessarily the case. And so I think from the very beginning, we have to counter that narrative, and that we have to exploit the vulnerabilities of what could seemingly be a global network. And in a lot of ways, that works to our advantage.
I mean, just 2 points from me. I think what you've said about the Maoist insurgency and those principles is clearly important. In the case of Mindanao, the kind of the old school insurgents, revolutionaries that spoke to their reference now. I mean, it's part of the training that you get as a young man. There is and that was in a sense why there was so much surprise during the Marawi siege. That they're staying in this urban area, but you're going to hurt the civilian population by staying here. You can't do that. Like, you've got what you need, get out. And when they stayed, it was a bizarre thing, and it was just scary. And then people tried to get out of there. And so I think that the question you ask is actually really important in a much deeper sense. Is the way that the permeation of these ideas had affected the way that this warfare was perceived by locals. Was it the right way to do an insurgency? I'm increasingly convinced that when you look at the Marawi siege and you try to understand what the rationale must have been for that, the idea of sparking a more popular response, I think, that if you look at the Marawi siege as a single attempt at glory, I don't think that is supported by the evidence. I think that there is a range of different pieces to this puzzle that as you put it together, the case is much stronger. That in fact there was some direct, certainly some sort of approval from Central at least leading up to the operation, and that certainly shaped how they engaged in the operation, but that ultimately the purpose of Marawi was to plant these larger pragmatic and symbolic seeds for an ongoing future battle. And you just look at the way that this is playing out. You look at the skirmishes through Lanao del Sur, south of Lake Lanao. It'd be very interesting to see how the arms from Marawi have moved through Mindanao, if they have at all. Don't forget, there are several channels in Mindanao, through the Sulu Archipelago, around that Lake Lanao region, and then through that Maguindanao area to the east of that horseshoe shape I was talking about. A very important point, the last question about the ISIS offering a model to replicate. I think that's probably their greatest contribution, is that methodology, is a set of principles combined together that are adaptable and provide a framework for how to combine governance, violence, and propaganda for kind of high impact. You can see the way, in the example of the Philippines again, that those principles were applied, but they were nuanced for local conditions. So much of the capacity building work that I'm doing throughout the region is essentially designed to provide civil society, local actors, military with a counter to that at a grassroots bottom-up level. There's a lot of top-down kind of things that come from governments. Our capacity building work is trying to create a bottom-up grassroots buffer to that. So we work in areas where ISIS have been most active, and that's the ultimate intent of this. How successful it is, we'll see in the next few years.
So just to tap into Brad's point, and just to push back just a slight bit, I won't push back too much again.
Do it all.
Getting contentious.
No, they don't have, the leverage is what's important. You see it in their media, how they're able to get franchises to do exactly what they want to do in media. So I think they're, tapping into what Haror is saying is, what they've improved on the previous model, let's say Al-Qaeda, is the ability to leverage locals to do the bidding of the global fight, which might not be to their benefit, as we saw in Morale, right? So how did they do that? How do they exist leverage when they really don't have strong connections? I mean, the connections to Morale, for example, are thin. There are a couple people using communications technologies. That's not a lot of leverage, right? The military usually you have to be on someone to leverage them, right? But they have rules, and they set out incentives for the Walaya to meet in order. And so those rules, if you want to be part of the franchise, if you want that franchise branding of McDonald's, you've got to do these things. And we don't give it to you until you do. And it's largely that the Philippines really hasn't gotten that. Although they're described as actions taking place in a Walaya, a province, they have not gotten the recognition, either individually or as part of East Asia, of reaching this particular status. So how do you get these leverage? Media is one. As far as controlling media output, it's being done by Central. And it's improved the local stuff, but that's part of the quid pro quo between the higher and the lower. And the political consolidation is another one of the requirements. There's a good article by Jacob Zen in Perspectives on Terrorism last month that talks about how Islamic State did it both in West Africa and in Philippines with very little leverage. But it's with a series of gates that people have to meet in order to be part of IS, which the locals kind of sort of wanted to be. So it is a mix of all of those things. I think that model, Jeff, is kind of what you're alluding to, I think. They have a series of criteria, and they're fairly strictly, they're not just giving it to anybody. I think that's an important advancement, as Aurora said. And it utilizes leverage they otherwise would not have.
So I'm going to comment on the cyber component really quickly and then give us some concluding points and then let you guys begin your week. So especially for today's conversation, looking at cyber, I think it's important to divide into two kind of conceptions. One, there's a conversation about content moderation, but then two, there's this conversation that we still haven't had, especially in the tech space, about what does tech mean to these actors, not only the tippity top of their organizations, but also the bottom, and what does that mean both for coordination and discord. So I think that there are all of these things that we are talking about today, which sometimes you see online and sometimes you don't. Looking at the connections with the Philippines online, for example, a lot of regular pro-IS groups online will talk about the Philippines. Even if IS Central and sort of more formal components of the organization do not put it on the top of their agenda items. So what is amalgamous online is sometimes confused with what is more concrete offline, and having those local perspectives is something that's so vital. And if you'd like to talk more about the content moderation side, I would love to do that all day, so hit me up on the side. So moving forward and trying to conclude this really, really great conversation, the first point I want to make is that something that came up over and over again is really the layman conception that winning and losing, the utility of that language, is really lackluster in a space where we're talking about the second stage of protracted war. So it's this slow, sort of grueling, ongoing phase that it isn't as clear and distinct as winning and losing. So next is that leadership matters, but so do civilians and local populations. And what does this mean in terms of a population-centric and a population-aware strategy for both insurgents or armies, depending on what stage they're at in their sort of own capacity, as well as how we think about the problems. So because of this, partnerships are vital. Partnerships sort of at all tiers and sort of, as you said, echelons. So one thing I want to point out is that all of these speakers at one point or the other were referring to each other and sort of doing some weird hands-on pantomiming. And I think that the thing that's really important about this is that it's actually alluding to these real like hands-on experiences, and they're talking about what is a lateral, they're all giggling at me. But what do these like lateral partnerships and what do these more interactive things bring to the equation? And I know it's something that seems kind of so silly and half-hearted, but these views, if we have fewer and fewer boots on the ground, are going to become more and more rare. So the importance of sort of keeping that at the table, whether it's at POE or your own organizations, is so important. And then so the last point that I sort of want to end on is the importance of not leaving behind what matters or knowing what you're leaving behind, and sort of staying attuned to that when we think about forward thinking and forward planning, to be able to communicate really effectively early and often about expectations and what we can bring and what we can promise, because this has incredible implications at present and down the line for what commitment we can get from others. So I think really the last point is when we think about what's happening on the ground, staying true to what's best in the short, medium, and long term is such an important conversation. So I'm so grateful to have you guys here today, and I would like to give a special thanks to all our panelists.